So I start these talks. I've given variations of the talks a few times, and each time I start out with the latest mass shooting. And somewhat depressingly, I've had to update it every single time I give this talk. So this is, of course, the latest mass shooting. Can you guys see? This is the latest mass shooting in Florida a few weeks ago, 17 people killed. That comes hot in the heels of the Las Vegas shooting that killed 59 back in October. And of course, the Sutherland, Texas church massacre that killed 26, which occurred last November. Now, if it seems to you like we're having more and more mass shootings, you're right, we are. They go up every year. And in fact, although there was a little dip last year in terms of mass shootings, the number of casualties have gone up. The number of casualties have gone up because each shooting is more deadly. So violence is a problem. The Washington Post has a wonderful graphic where they've graphically laid out a lot of the mass shootings since the 60s. So this is 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The size of the purple indicates how many people were killed, and the size of the gray indicates how many people were injured. So you can just see from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, there's more and more in purple. And the 2010s, it's really terrible, right? Now, if we zoom in onto the last few years, you can see that this biggest thing is the Las Vegas shooting, right? 59 killed, that's the purple, and then 422 injured. Sorry, pointer problems. The Sutherland Springs, Texas shooting happened a few months after that, 27 killed. And then there's the Parkland, Florida shooting that happened just 2 weeks ago. And this big thing, anyone know what that is? That's the Pulse nightclub, exactly. So 50 people killed. And so, in the past year and a half, we've had 4 of the deadliest shootings of all time happen, and 3 of them happened in the past 5 months. So I'm a forensic psychiatrist with a background in neuroscience. I'm proud to say that I work for the state hospital, one of the finest psychiatric hospitals in the world, I believe. And there I'm the director of the Forensic Evaluation Service, and I have a couple of my peeps back there, so hi guys. So in my position, I think about the following questions quite a bit. Why do people commit violence? How can we reduce violence? And I want to talk about these questions through the lens of psychopathy. So with regards to psychopathy, first I'm going to talk about the neuroscience of psychopathy. Then I'm going to talk about some of the tools that neuroscientists use to discover things. I'm going to talk about some of the legal implications of psychopathy, especially that it's now being seen as more and more of a biological condition. And then the last part of the talk is going to be about what to do with psychopaths. Now, you can see the world of violent offenders for repeat violent offenders. And if we look under the hood, we see that there's 3 distinct populations. There's a population of people with severe mental illness, and then a large population of people that we consider antisocial. And within that antisocial group, there's a smaller population that we call psychopaths. Now, one way to distinguish these different groups is that people with severe mental illness typically commit violent acts for irrational reasons, whereas people who are antisocial typically commit violence for rational reasons. Now, after every mass shooting, there's typically some sort of scapegoating of the mentally ill, as a lot of what Judge Wren's talk was about. And so this happened this time too. Trump says, focuses on mental health over guns. And a spokesperson for the NRA said, people who are crazy should not be able to get firearms. Enforcement of mental health laws, not new gun restrictions, would prevent future massacres. Now, I'm not a gun control expert, but let me give you some facts that I think show why this is such a misguided approach to solely focus on the mentally ill who are violent. When you look at the world of people with severe mental illness, they constitute 4% of the adult population, but they only commit 3% of overall violence. In other words, people with severe mental illness are actually less violent than the average person. And when you look at mass shootings, they commit fewer than 1% of the mass shootings. So you can completely get rid of all severe mental illness, completely get rid of their access to guns, everything, and you would drop mass shootings by less than 1%. In contrast, if we look at psychopaths, psychopaths are 1% of the adult male population. They constitute 20% of people in prison, and because they recidivate so frequently and so often, it's thought that they're responsible for over half of all violent crime. 1% of the population responsible for over half of all violent crime. So this is a population that's worth studying. Now, if we look at this world of people with antisocial personality disorder, it's a large diagnostic category that basically captures the idea of people who have a pervasive pattern and disregard for and violation of the rights for others. It basically it describes a population of people who commit repeated criminal acts, essentially. Within this group, though, there's a group of psychopaths, and it's really important to distinguish these groups apart. So let's move them apart. So these are mutually exclusive categories. So this category, without the psychopaths, is antisocial personality disorder without psychopathy, and this is antisocial personality disorder with psychopathy. Does that make sense? They are mutually exclusive categories. If you're a psychopath, you're not this guy. If you're this guy, you're not a psychopath. It's important to distinguish these two populations because they're so different. So people with antisocial personality disorder without psychopathy are considered hot-headed. People who are psychopaths are called cold-blooded. And when you look at the characteristics of this population, it's a population of people who have a lot of anxiety, who are very emotionally labile, they're extremely emotional, and they commit a lot of impulsive aggression. So typically it'll be someone with a mild provocation that's taken out of context, and there's an overreaction to that, and there's some sort of violence that ensues. Now, most of the people in this population have had trauma and an adverse childhood, and that neatly explains pretty much everything about them, right? So they have a trauma history, they were grown up in an atmosphere of violence, and that explains why they are overreactive and they're violent as adults. So it's thought for this population, the environment is really critical in shaping how this person becomes a violent criminal. And so to fix this problem, we have to fix the environment, essentially. Now, on the other hand, psychopathy, psychopaths are characterized by having low levels of anxiety and fear. In fact, in a lot of ways, they're healthier than the average person because anxiety is bad for your health, right? So a lot of psychopaths are just really cool. They're not up at night, tossing and turning at night for what they've done. They're actually healthier than the average person because they have such low levels of anxiety. They're described as emotionally detached and have shallow affect. And most of the aggression that they do is planned. So it's something that they can kind of, in a cold-blooded way, calculate a plan to hurt someone over a long period of time. And the weird thing about this population is that they come from intact backgrounds. Really? Yeah, most of them come from intact backgrounds. See a hand. This is a small enough room. I think we can just kind of shout out questions. Yeah, so cold-blooded versus hot-blooded aggression has been studied a lot, and in fact, we're all capable of both. We can do both, right? We can react out of hand. We can also calculate and plan aggression. So this is a characteristic that is just two different ways to be aggressive for everyone. Psychopaths are especially attuned through their neurobiology to be more of the cold-blooded type. So there is a convergence there. So so the weird thing is a lot of psychopaths come from perfectly fine families, no violence in their family background, good families. So that's one of the early clues to researchers that kind of indicated that this might be a genetic condition, with the environment being less important. Now, other evidence that this might be a genetic condition rather than due to the environment is that you can see children with psychopathic traits from a very early age. So this is a description from a New York Times article called "Can You Call a 9-Year-Old a Psychopath?" We don't call young children psychopaths because it's a pejorative label that can be self-fulfilling. So we call these youths with callous, unemotional traits, and I really like that label because it implies that it's treatable and fixable. They're not psychopaths yet, right? So Paul Frick, a psychologist, describes one boy who used a knife to cut off the tail of the family cat bit by bit over a period of weeks. The boy was proud of the serial amputations, which his parents initially failed to notice. When we talked about it, he was very straightforward. He said, "I want to be a scientist, and I was experimenting. I wanted to see how the cat would react." That is a cold-blooded little kid. This is from an Atlantic article, "When Your Child is a Psychopath." Starting at age 6, Samantha began drawing pictures of murder weapons: a knife, a bow and arrow, chemicals for poisoning, a plastic bag for suffocating. She tells me that she pretended to kill her stuffed animals. "You were practicing on your stuffed animals?" I ask her. She nods. "How did you feel when you were doing that?" "Happy." "Why did it make you happy?" "Because I thought that someday I was going to end up doing it on somebody." "Did you ever try?" "I choked my little brother." This is when Samantha was 6 and the little brother was 2 months old. So the evidence that there's a biological basis to psychopathy consists of the following. Many psychopaths come from intact backgrounds, so just a bad environment can explain psychopathy. We know, and this is probably the strongest bit of evidence, we know it's strongly heritable by looking at twin studies. If you look at identical twins and one is a psychopath, it's very likely that the other is a psychopath. Whereas if you look at fraternal twins, if one is a psychopath, it raises the chances a little bit, but not much, that the other is a psychopath. So this really calls, it's strong evidence for genetic inheritance. The traits are apparent from an early childhood, and you can see brain differences from a very early age as well. So the idea is that bad genes lead to brain abnormalities that lead to deviant behaviors. Now, I want to just, before I go on, make a little detour and talk about psychopathy versus psychosis. They sound similar, and a lot of people get confused about these two different terms. So psychosis is a constellation of symptoms that are indicative of a severe mental illness, as most of you in this room probably know, things like delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thought process, and so forth. It renders people irrational and unable to distinguish reality from fact from delusion. And it makes you eligible for the insanity defense. In contrast, psychopathy, is a personality disorder. So it's considered a mental illness, but it's a personality disorder, so not considered a severe mental illness. And the people who are psychopaths are rational. They know perfectly well what they're doing, and they're not delusional about it. And they are ineligible for the insanity defense currently, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm just going to cut you off in the interest of time. I think there's a lot of gray areas, but I think we can all agree that certain acts are incredibly irrational and delusional, and some acts are rational. And I'm just going to skip over the gray part just in the interest of time. We can talk more afterwards. So anyone recognize who this is on the right? Right, Andrea Yates. Slide problems. So Andrea Yates, yeah. So poor Andrea Yates has a history of severe postpartum psychoses. She drowned and killed all 5 of her kids, including her little baby. So after the birth of each one of her kids, she became highly psychotic, postpartum psychosis, and she was hospitalized. So absolutely genuine, bona fide evidence of mental illness. In 2001, she drowned. She had her 5th child, and shortly after she had her 5th child, she had another postpartum psychosis, and she drowned all her children. The expert in the case was Dr. Resnick, one of the forensic superstars in the field, and he said, Yates believed deeply that killing her children was the right thing to do. She believed that Satan had taken over her body and soul and was eyeing her children's souls next. She believed that if she killed her children while they were still innocent, they would be sent to heaven. Right? So, insane, not insane? Yeah. Actually, the first time it was held in Texas, she was found sane, but there was a mistrial for technical reasons, and on the retrial, she was found insane, which I think was the proper adjudication. In contrast, you guys recognize who this is? Diane Downs. Who is Diane Downs? No history of mental illness. She shot 3 children, she killed one of them, and then she shot her forearm, then drove to the ER and said she was carjacked by a stranger. Why on earth would she do that? Well, it turns out at her trial, one of her children testified, one of her surviving children said, well, Mommy was dating a guy named RK, and basically this guy didn't want to be in a relationship with someone with children. So, Mommy tried to kill all of us so that she could continue dating this person who didn't want to have children in his life. So that's pretty cold-blooded, right? It's like she tried to kill her children to improve her dating life. Yeah.
So I know with Diane Downs, her behavior, like in the ER and in court, they could tell. And I was thinking back to the child that hurt the cat, and he wanted to see how they reacted. Do you think there's a connection with trying to learn how other people react to that kind of thing so they can mimic it? Or is it just
Absolutely, and we'll go into it more. I mean, I think the biological wiring that psychopaths inherit predispose them to violence, but don't predestine them to have violence. So we'll talk about that environment by gene interaction as we go through the talk.
Doug, I've got a quick reference question. At what age do children normally begin to
From day one. Yeah. So there's, it's a big thing, but basically we have two different sets of empathy neural systems. And I'm going to talk about one of those empathy neural systems that comes online a little bit later, around age 4 or 5. But we're also born with this hardwired, fast, primitive empathy system that's dictated by mirror neurons, and we're born with that. So babies from day one, if you put a baby in a room and put another baby next to them and that baby starts to cry, often that first baby will start to cry as well. So that's an example of emotional resonance, and that's, we think, accomplished by mirror neurons, which I won't be talking about today, but it's a fascinating kind of side topic. I had to cut something out. This is a lot better, though. I gave a TED Talk last week. I had to cut everything down to 17 and a half minutes. So you're getting the 75-minute extended director's cut. So, all right. And I think this is a lot better talk. But I'm still not going to talk about mirror neurons because I don't have 2 hours. And plus, your brain's it's going to explode by the end anyway. So people who are psychotic are irrational. People who have psychopathy are rational. And how sympathetic, so like just if we're going to have a little sympathy gauge, how sympathetic do you feel towards Andrea Yates? Yeah, I mean, you feel pretty sympathetic, right? And how about Diane Downs? Thumbs down, right? Frowny face, right? So just keep that in mind, and we're going to raise up that question a little bit later. Okay, so psychopaths lack conscience. And the Robert Hare is the premier psychopathy researcher in the world. He's the one that developed the PCL, the psychopathy checklist, which is the standardized instrument we use to gauge whether someone is a psychopath or not. He wrote a book called Without Conscience. Just if you can summarize a psychopath in 2 words, it's they don't have a conscience. Which raises the question, what is a conscience, right? And in a room in this size, you're a pretty active crowd. You don't want to just shout out some ideas about what you think a conscience is? Empathy, so empathy might be a component of it. Guilt and shame, the ability to feel guilt and shame. Okay. Knowing right for wrong, and is that knowing a rational knowing, or is it an emotional knowing? It's both, but which one's more important? So caring, so that's sort of an emotion, right? So do we have to, how do you know that it's wrong to strangle the person that's next to you? Right. You don't want them to die, but is that like something you have to think through, that that's something wrong to do? Yeah.
Instead of the fear of not liking someone, but maybe it's the love of someone else that keeps you from doing something.
Yeah, so there's positive parts too, so empathy, So conscience can guide you positively, it can guide you negatively. It's like the little angel and the little devil that's on your shoulder, right? So I would argue that, so the way I view conscience is like, it's sort of like a moral GPS. So, right, that's constantly online, and it's kind of steering you in the right direction. And I would argue that that steering mechanism is mostly an emotional mechanism. That although reasons are important, that we mostly are guided by, and the reason I don't strangle people, there's lots of reasons, right? But even if it came down to it, I had to strangle this guy right here to save all of your lives, I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could do it. And that's because it just feels so horrible to well, maybe not. I could strangle this guy, but this woman here. But my boss is back there, so. But no, I wouldn't strangle her either. All right, so I think it's emotional. Okay. So now, what's really fascinating is that psychopaths have a disease called the lack of conscience, and the study of psychopaths has been a boon to neuroscientists. By studying psychopaths in the lab, we have come to a much better understanding of what the conscience is and what parts of the brain are responsible for generating the conscience. So what part of the brain is responsible for generating the conscience? There's lots of areas that are involved, but there's an area called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that I want to introduce you to. The VMPFC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, many of you are actually familiar with this brain area already, although you might not know it. So who is this guy? Phineas Gage, the most famous case study in neuroscience. I read somewhere that like half of cognitive neuroscience textbooks start with Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad foreman who was like a really outstanding foreman. He was punctual, he was reliable, he was well loved by everyone who worked for him. And unfortunately, through a railroad accident, this tamping iron flew through his head, through his skull, and came out the other side. One of the remarkable things about Phineas Gage is he survived that. But the other remarkable thing about Phineas Gage is that his personality changed. Where he used to be like this outstanding citizen, he turned essentially into a psychopath. So John Martin Harlow is the country physician that treated Phineas Gage and became famous by kind of telling medical societies about Phineas Gage. And this is how he described Phineas Gage. The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned, in turn for others appearing more feasible. Sound like anyone you know? I mean, I know a bunch of people like this. But the fact is, basically, his mind was radically changed, so his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. He survived, yet he didn't survive. So we know from, until the 1990s, we didn't know exactly where this tamping iron through we had the skull, but we didn't know exactly what part of his brain was affected. But in the 90s, by a couple of researchers got the skull, which is housed at one of the museums at Harvard, put it through a CAT scanner, so they had a three-dimensional model of the skull, then placed a three-dimensional model of the brain inside that skull, and calculated the trajectory of the rod. And so what you see what this rod is going through is exactly this spot, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So in an instant, he had his ventromedial prefrontal cortex removed, and although he had normal cognition in terms of he had memory, he could talk, his language is intact, and he still had emotions, the balance between those two was destroyed. And I would argue that the essential change that happened is he became conscience-less. So let's look a little bit more closely at this area. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, it sits on the middle surfaces of both cerebral hemispheres. If you crack this open, you'll see it right here. This is the ventral and medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And here's another view of it. This is a key area for emotional intelligence, and it participates in at least three things that I believe are essential for generating a conscience. It's involved in the formation of emotional memories, which form the basis of social inhibitions. It's an important component of the brain's imagination engine, which is important to feel empathy. And it's involved in impulse control, which is important for wise decision making. I would argue that these three things, social inhibitions, empathy, and impulse control, form the basis of the conscience. If you don't have this, you don't have a conscience, and you turn to this guy. Let's start with the first, emotional memories. Now, I have a toddler named Kyle. He is, this isn't him, but he's a little 2.5 years old, and anyone who's raised toddlers know that they can be like little savages, right? I mean, they can bite, they can kick, they can scream, and over time, we civilize them, right? We socialize them to stop biting and kicking and screaming all the time. And how do we do that? Right? Every time they bite or kick or scream, someone important to them says, don't do that. It makes you feel really bad about it inside, right? So over time, you store that emotional linkage of the act and the consequence, and once you have that stored in your memory, that can help guide you with future behaviors. So it's mama in the cookie jar. So every time you reach in that cookie bar, did something bad, your mama slapped your wrist, that generated an emotional linkage of the act with an emotion in your body that felt bad. Those linkages were stored by the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and when you were in a similar situation where you're thinking about hitting your brother again or putting your hand in that cookie jar, this area of the brain automatically replays that emotional memory so you feel bad in your body just anticipating doing that act. Right? So you can see how that would be the formation over and over again of our social inhibitions against committing violence against other people, for instance. Right? I would argue that this kind of emotional memory is an essential part of what I call our moral GPS. And when you think about it, for the forensic people in the crowd, this is the basis of direct deterrence, right? Or punishment learning. One of the reasons we punish people and punishment is painful is because we want them to link up a painful feeling in their body to the commission of the act, right? So that linkage is stored in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. If that area of your brain isn't working so hot, what happens? You don't learn from punishment, essentially. And that is one of the essential things about psychopaths that can explain their high recidivism rate. You can punish them up the wazoo, it just doesn't seem to stick. Now, let's go on to the second function, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex's role in empathy. So what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It's the foundation for pro-social behavior, and we're all hardwired for it because there's an obvious evolutionary benefit, right? Being wired to act pro-socially allows us to live in large groups, and those large groups can obtain resources, can protect from predators, and so on. So it confers an evolutionary advantage. When you think about it, empathy requires imagination, because it requires that you basically put yourself in the shoes of another person. Now, imagination is one of the coolest things your brain pulls off. So, you can all close your eyes and think back to a really emotionally important day. So maybe it's the day that you got married, maybe it's the day you got divorced, maybe it's the day your first child was born, right? And the thing is, you can recreate that entire scenario, thoughts, images, sounds, and feelings. You can literally replay the feeling that you had in the past, right? You can do the same thing for the future. You can imagine yourself going into, to see your boss and asking for a raise, right? You can think about, what that's going to sound like, what they might be saying, and you can also start imagining your heart starting to pump a little faster, right? It actually starts to generate the feeling you might experience in that situation. That all requires imagination. And this is a bit of an aside, but I think reading is such a cool thing. I mean, what is reading? Reading is like inputting this one-dimensional stream of text straight into your brain, and that can ignite this entire virtual simulation. It creates an entire world that you can step in, a world that's complete with sounds and visuals and feelings. You can literally become those characters. That's a really cool thing your brain does. Now, how does the brain accomplish that? It uses the imagination engine, which is a set of interconnected brain areas that generate virtual simulations. So it can replay experiences from the past, it can generate future scenarios, and it can also generate simulations of other minds so you can understand what other people might be thinking and feeling. Now, what's really cool is that these simulations, right, are not just cognitive. They're not just thoughts and the facts of what happened. It's also the feelings of what happens, right? What's really cool is that each of these different parts of the imagination engine computes a different part of the simulation. So one part, for instance, is the hippocampus right here, which is one of your essential memory areas. So the imagination engine has access to your rich treasure trove of past experiences from which to replay those experiences or to generate new experiences. The dorsal medial prefrontal cortex calculates the cognitive part of the simulation. So it can figure out, what your boss might be saying, what your boss might be thinking, what other people might be thinking. And the ventral medial prefrontal cortex can generate the emotional part of the simulation. So, when you're talking to someone or you're picturing talking to your boss in the future, you can imagine what you might be feeling in the future. You can imagine what your boss might be feeling in the future, right? Now, it turns out in psychopaths, this area, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, is just fine. So they're perfectly fine in terms of understanding what other people are thinking. That allows them to lie and manipulate well. On the other hand, they have a ventral medial prefrontal cortex that's not working so well. So they have problems imagining what other people might be feeling. Not just cognitively imagining what other people might be feeling what other people might be feeling. Right? And if you don't feel what other people are feeling, you have impaired empathy, and essentially other people become they're like objects. And that obviously can predispose you to harming them, right? Because we think about throwing out a dead hard drive very differently than strangling someone. Right? A psychopathic researcher said it this way: psychopaths know the words, but not the music. Anyone recognize this woman? Yeah, this might date you a little bit. Who is this? What movie is this from? Fatal Attraction. Now, for those youngsters that haven't seen this movie, I would say go see this movie. What is a central lesson in this movie? Don't cheat on your wife. That is a central message of this movie. And people watching it are steadily shown a series of events which make most people feel horror, like this feeling of horror at cheating at your wife. What do you think happened to cheating people, men and women too, I guess mostly men though, who watched this? What do you think happened to their rate of cheating on their wife afterwards, right? It went down, right? So this is an example of indirect deterrence. We can learn from stories. I don't have to cheat on my wife to really figure out what that feels like. I can watch someone else cheat on their wife and see what happens and feel those horrible feelings, right? That's learning through vicarious experience. And that's the basis for indirect deterrence, right? So if this area is not working so hot, not only do you have impaired punishment learning, that mama in the cookie jar thing, but you also can't learn from other people's stories because like people tell you about their horrible experience. You're like, oh, okay, whatever. I'm gonna watch some soccer now. It's like it just doesn't affect you, right? So they have problems learning from indirect deterrence as well. Deterrence doesn't work with psychopaths. That's why they recidivate so frequently. That's such a great question, and it's something I didn't forget to mention. But yeah, one thing that's really interesting that distinguishes psychopaths from people with autism is that people with autism have defects in both these areas, both the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So they have trouble understanding what other people might be thinking, and they have trouble empathizing, feeling what other people might be feeling. Because they have trouble understanding what other people might be thinking. I mean, anyone know someone with autism who's a really great liar? Really? Okay. All right. I mean, in general, though, people with autism are not so hot at lying, right? Because they have to know they have to be able to manipulate you. And to do that well, they really kind of have to figure out what you're about, essentially. That's a great question. Let's go into the last part of the roles of the VMPFC is impulse control. So its role in decision making. Now, I'm going to introduce two brain areas that you might know already, the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. So these are two primitive brain areas that constantly scan the environment for things that are essential for your survival, essentially. So the amygdala is your monster detector. Right? It scans for things that might be threats in your environment. When it finds something that's a threat in your environment, it activates and generates feelings in you that make you want to move away from that object, feeling like fear, horror, stuff like that. On the other hand, the nucleus accumbens is our donut detector. So it's constantly on the lookout for things that might be immediately gratifying to you, right? And when it finds those things, it starts to go ding-ling-ling-ling-ling-ling, and it generates a feeling in you that makes you want to get closer, feelings of craving or attraction. Now the thing is, you don't run after every donut, you don't run away from everything that might be scary, right? Why is that? Well, it's because the amygdala and nucleus accumbens are not decision-making areas of your brain. The brain is organized like a corporation with a hierarchy. And so, the amygdala and nucleus accumbens are like really hardworking, essential, low-level employees. They're just constantly churning out, working for things that that you need to know about. It thinks. It's not sure, but it thinks you need to know about. So, so then it feeds that information to executive areas of the brain that do make decisions. Executive areas like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So they're hooked up to the VMPFC. The VMPFC gets this information, says, okay, it looks like you're scared of something. Okay, there's a donut there. But it doesn't act immediately. It has, like a good executive, it has access to multiple streams of information, right? So the VMPFC is sort of like the wise guru that sits in your cortex. And it considers information from your basic drives, but it also considers information that comes from other areas, like your hippocampus, so it consults your memory and experiences. Oh, I want to eat that donut, but what's happened the last time I ate 5 donuts in a row? I didn't feel so hot, right? It also consults with areas of your brain that has reasons, right? So, oh, my high school reunion's coming up, and I'm trying to lose weight and fit into that, whatever. So so it can integrate. It makes an integrated decision that integrates your basic drives, your memories, and your reasons, and it makes wise decisions, right? Now, what happens in psychopathy, right? Psychopaths have shrunken amygdalas. So their monster detector isn't working so hot. So it's one of the reasons why they're fearless. Their nucleus accumbens, on the other hand, is overactive, enlarged and overactive. And so donuts look super duper good to them. So they're highly hedonic. They're highly sensitized towards immediate gratification, pleasurable gratification. And their VMPFC is not working so hot. So instead of having this wise guru, you have something more like this guy, right? And so this describes a brain that is fearless and highly attuned to hedonic pleasures. So this describes it goes part of the way to explaining why people who are psychopathic are so impulsive. Okay, so to reiterate, VMPFC, it has many roles that are all tied in with emotional intelligence. It has a role in forming emotional memories, which form the basis of social inhibitions against violence and form the basis for learning from punishment. It plays an important role in empathy, which is important for learning from indirect deterrence. And it has an important role in impulse control. Without these things, you're more likely to commit violent acts. Now, I want to move on to the second part of the talk, which is describing some of the tools that neuroscientists have used to discover these things. Right? So this is kind of a more fluffy part of the talk, and you can kind of sit back and enjoy. Like, how do we know these things about psychopaths, or any neuroscience question? Well, a lot of it comes from loss of function studies, so people who have somehow part of their brain through a stroke or through a brain injury, and discovering what parts of them don't work anymore, right? Loss of function studies. Now, the problem is, for a long period of time, it was really slow going. The only way you could figure out if someone who had a stroke and had lost their ability to move their left hand, to figure out what part of their brain was broken in the old days, you had to wait until they died, and then you had to slice their brain, right, and discover where the lesion is. That's really slow going, right? And this is Broca and Wernicke. These are two famous doctors that figured out language areas of the brain by studying patients who had lost specific subsets of language abilities, and they traced that back to specific areas of the brain. But they had to wait for the patients to die to slice up their brain to figure that out. Now, this could be vastly speeded up if we could just see the brain in a living person, right? Before you have to like slice it up, right? So the imaging revolution started in 1895 with the development of X-rays, right? This is the first X-ray ever in 1895. It's the wife of Röntgen who saw it and said, "I have seen my death." This caused quite a stir. X-rays, or you shoot X-rays from a source through the body. There's a photographic film plate on the other side. And the X-rays are stopped by things like bone, and so you basically see a shadow picture on the photographic film. Now, you can't really see the brain, though, on an X-ray because the brain is inside the skull, and the skull stops most of the X-rays. And you also see this very flattened image of all three dimensions compressed into one plane. So it's not a great way to see the brain. So that for a long time, the brain was called the dark continent. Now, it turns out you can see some things on an X-ray. So I don't know if you know this, but all of you have holes in your head. They're called ventricles, and that's where the cerebral spinal fluid circulates. So this is the ventricle system. And it turns out that if you inject air into the system, initially they took big needles full of air and went through your brain into the ventricle to inject the air. Then they discovered, you don't have to do that. You can just do like a spinal tap kind of thing where you inject bubbles through your spinal column. So that's a lot easier. But if you do that, since air is so undense compared to the rest of the brain tissue, you can start to sort of see the ventricles. So this is the beginning, is you can start to see some things on an X-ray. Now, we've come a long way. This is brain imaging in the 1960s. So after injecting this air bubble into your brain ventricle system or into your spinal cord, you were then put in this ridiculous thing that put you in, so to move the air bubble around, you were kind of twisted in different directions, and an X-ray was taken of you. And the joke was that this was a curative procedure because it caused such massive headaches, your patient never came back to see you again. In the 1960s, the CAT scan was invented, and I don't know if you know this, but the Beatles were super important in the development of the CAT scan. So the CAT scan was invented by EMI, right, the label of the Beatles. And because the Beatles were selling so many records, EMI had like tons of money on their hands. And they were like, what do we do with all this money? And a brilliant engineer at EMI said, I know what to do with that money. I'm going to invent a special X-ray which can take X-rays at all sorts of different angles, then use emerging computer technology to reconstruct all those different angles into a single image and see a lot more. It's a special kind of X-ray that I call the computed axial tomograph. So here's the inside of a CAT scan. It's basically taking X-rays from multiple angles around. So here's a diagram, taking tons of X-rays as it circles around. That's why CAT scans have a lot of radiation. You're getting like 100 or 1,000 X-rays essentially when you do this. But each of those X-rays are at a slightly different angle. And it turns out you can use computer reconstruction techniques, which he developed in the 60s, to reconstruct the image and create and actually see parts of brain. So this is the very first CAT scan in 1971. Anyone see anything? So it's really great when the very first thing you do with your new technology finds something that's actually like resectable and curable. So they found a tumor in this person. This had a whopping 80 by 80 resolution, but it was enough to find this frontal lobe tumor, which was then resected. There was an explosion of CAT scans after that, 40 CAT scans in the following years, and now pretty much half of all hospitals have a CAT scanner. Along the same lines, the MRI was invented, and the MRI, unlike the CAT scan, is super hard to explain. It would literally require a week of intense physics to explain it, but let me explain it in 1 minute. So the essence of the MRI is that it has 3 really powerful magnets that are oriented 90 degrees from each other. So these kind of like, there's a magnetic field that's generated this way, and this way. These 3 magnetic coils can, by varying the strength of each of those magnetic coils, it can interrogate any part of a three-dimensional space with the magnetic signature of that location. So what these magnets allow you to do is take up the brain and divide it into what are called voxels, little cubes, and interrogate the magnetic qualities of that little cube and translate that into a picture. And because different parts of your brain have varying amounts of fat and water and proteins, it can actually generate an image. So for MRIs, the resolution depends on the strength of the magnetic field. So bigger magnets are better. The first magnets were 0.35 Tesla, and this is a typical image from that. Then came 1.5 Tesla magnets. The typical scanner now has a 3 Tesla magnet. Researchers often use 7 Tesla magnets. And if you compare the initial 0.35 versus the modern 7 Tesla magnets, it's remarkable how well we can see the brain now. This is the world's most powerful MRI. It's called Anumac. That's a person that's in there. It's going to generate an 11.75 Tesla field, which is going to be unbelievable in terms of the images it produces. I don't think you can go much past this because I think at a certain point it starts to yank around your red blood cells, which contain iron. So you start to feel like dizzy. And but this is going to be incredible. And like a lot of really big, expensive projects, it keeps getting delayed. But I'm looking forward to the images that come out of this machine. Now, so imaging is really great for loss of function studies. You have a patient, has a stroke, they lose an ability to do something, and you can image to see what part of their brain, so you can start making those correlations. But still, loss of function studies are still limiting. It's kind of like you figuring out what your iPhone, like what different chips in your iPhone does by taking an ice pick and stabbing random parts of it and figuring out what it can't do anymore, right? So wouldn't it be great if we can see the actual normal intact brain in action? And that's the idea of functional imaging, right? So the two main functional imaging modalities now are PET and fMRI. This is interesting. This is a PET scan of Jim Fallon, who is a psychopath researcher, who discovered through his own research that he scanned his own brain, and he turns out he has a psychopathic brain, although he's not a criminal. But his wife was like, yeah, you're a psychopath, But this is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's less active than the control. This is his wife, I think, right? So fMRI is the predominant activity measurer because you don't have to inject radioactive particles. So I'm going to mostly focus on MRI. And the thing to realize about every functional imaging modality, whether it's fMRI or PET scans or whatever the exotic new thing is, they're all indirect ways to measure brain activity. This is not a picture of like electrical storms happening in your brain. It's actually a picture of, it's a statistical map that shows you where blood flow is going. And it turns out that areas of your brain that are working hard recruit more blood flow. That additional blood flow changes the oxygen concentration in that area, and that change can be detected magnetically. So what you're actually seeing are parts of the brain that are getting more oxygen when you're doing a certain kind of task, right? It's a highly processed image. It's a statistical image. There are many steps involved. And I'm involved in cases where they're trying to introduce fMRI evidence, saying, oh, this fMRI shows the frontal lobes are too inactive or the amygdala is overactive. And here's the problem with that. One is that there don't exist standards for fMRI acquisition. So there's a million fMRI labs doing fMRIs that all have different settings on those millions of steps you need to generate the image. Without standardization, there's this problem called dial-a defect, where you can change those thresholds and statistical assumptions to make a defect seem larger or smaller. We also lack norms. So, how do you know if amygdala is overactive? How do you know if a frontal lobe is less active? What you need to do is scan just a shitload of people, right? With normal people, with their amygdalas and their frontal lobes, to give you a general sense of like what does it mean to be abnormally high or low. We don't have that database yet, so it's all this kind of very primitive stages right now. And we discovered 2 years ago that a really obscure statistical setting that's very obscure, I can't even explain it to you, is actually wrong, and it basically throws out like half of all fMRI results. So fMRI has only been around for about 20 years, and we're still finding like hidden problems with it. There's a great paper that goes through this in detail in the Stanford Law Review. I'm happy to email this presentation to anyone who wants it if you want to look at the references. I want to take you into the future. So the future is being developed by this man. His name is Carl Dijsselroth. If you haven't heard his name, you will. He is sure to win the Nobel Prize. He's a genius psychiatrist who's at Stanford. And he invented not one, but two incredible technologies that have fundamentally changed the way neuroscientists approach their work. One is called clarity. So his lab invented a way to take a brain, this is a mouse brain, and make it clear. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is a big deal, because once the brain is clear, you can then label it with fluorescent dyes and start to see fiber pathways that go across the entire brain. By rendering the brain clear, you can start to see all the different connections in the brain. So here's a video of it. So this is a mouse brain that's been rendered clear and then dyed with a special fluorescent dye that labels axons and neurons. So you take that brain, you feed into the microscope, which takes optical slices of the brain and then reconstructs it in 3 dimensions. So essentially, that's just hippocampus right there. It's essentially, once the microscope scans in the entire brain, you have this 3-dimensional model of an actual brain and all of the neurons and interconnections. So it scanned it all in. Now it's creating the 3-dimensional model. And it's not a model. This is not an artist's rendering. This is actual data of what this brain is like. And you can see individual neurons. You can see fiber pathways across the entire brain. Pretty cool, right? Now, he invented another technology that's even more important called optogenetics. So optogenetics, and this is a mouse wired with a fiber optic. Optogenetics was invented, I think, in 2008. And it basically, so Carl Dastroth figured out a way to infect neurons using a virus, special kind of virus, with a special receptor that's sensitive to light. So when the infected neuron that has that inserted receptor, when a light is shown on it, it can either activate it or deactivate it. So when you think about what the implications of what this means, we now have the ability to target subsets of neurons with a receptor that we can either activate or inactivate with light. This allows neuroscientists to sculpt neural activity and probe neural activity, turn this off, turn that on, and see what happens to the mouse. It allows us to probe the brain in ways that are with an unprecedented level of precision. So here's an example of a mouse that's had optogenetically inserted. So this mouse has had, in part of its motor cortex, these receptors inserted. So the light is off now. And you can see that when the light turns on, it's on now, it activates the motor neurons to make this mouse want to walk in circles. The light's still on, still walking in circles. Now the light's off. So some of you might think this is pretty creepy, but this is actually super cool. So when you think about it, if we can find ways to, if we can find circuits in the brain that are responsible for violence and then fine-tune, precisely target those neurons and then turn those neurons up or down. People working in addiction studies are highly interested. Is there a subset of neurons that are specific for cocaine craving? If we can turn those specific neurons off, cocaine craving goes away. We've solved drug addiction, right? So the power of this is, it's future-oriented, but it's there. Okay, so coming back to reality, let's talk about some of the legal implications. I've just given you a lot of data that shows that there's a biological basis for psychopathy. Psychopaths have brains that are different than non-psychopaths, and it's through no fault of their own. It's because of the genes that they inherited. So a question that might arise is, are psychopaths mentally ill? And a related question is, are psychopaths legally responsible for their acts? So here's one view. This comes from the When Your Child is a Psychopath article. If Samantha's brain is wired for callousness, if she fails to experience empathy or remorse because she lacks the neural equipment, can we say that she is evil? These kids can't help it, Adrian Raine says. Adrian Raine's one of my mentors and a brilliant neurocriminologist at the University of Pennsylvania. These kids can't help it, Adrian Raine says. Kids don't grow up wanting to be psychopaths or serial killers. They grow up wanting to become baseball players or great football stars. It's not a choice. What do you guys think of that? Yeah, exactly. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think what we can say is that the psychopathic brain sets you up in a certain way. It deals you a certain deck of cards, right? Low empathy, low fear, high impulsiveness, right? And inability to learn from punishment, or less ability to learn from punishment. But those factors by themselves don't mean you're going to turn into a violent murderer, right? Right? So, they don't have the choice of the genes they inherited, but they might have the choice about how they use their deck of cards to get around in life, right? Yes, and we'll talk a lot about that.
Do we have the scientific sophistication to tell the difference between Samantha's brain and the brain of the neuropsychologist who investigates psychopathy?
I think we do at the group level. Like if we took 10 brains like Samantha's and 10 brains like Jim Fallon's, we could find differences. But there's a lot of individual variability. So it's hard to tell from a single brain whether it's psychopathic or not.
But you can't say, well, yeah, you can have a brain like that and then overcome it because we don't really know what a brain like that is.
I think you can say there are some examples of severe psychopaths that have severe derangements in their brain wiring. So I think you can say that. But I think what you cannot, but to make the connection from having low empathy to being a violent murderer that should never be responsible for what they do, that's a large leap. So think about kids who grew up with a horrible childhood. We know from tons of brain studies that their brains are different. A terrible childhood trauma, malnutrition, it changes your brain in ways we can scan and observe. Does that mean everyone with a bad childhood should get off the hook? I think actually there should be mitigation, but the legal system doesn't generally buy that argument. What about men, right? Men have testosterone. Men are responsible for 90% of violent crimes. Testosterone makes you aggressive. If I inject testosterone into you, you're going to be aggressive. Does that mean all men should be freed from responsibility for violent crimes? Right? So there's biological predisposition, and then there's criminal responsibility.
The premise of the novel A Clockwork Orange is that you can, through negative reinforcement, alter the psychopath mind against his will. Any validity there?
I think Anthony Burgess is a brilliant writer, but if that person in Clockwork Orange was actually a psychopath, aversive condition shouldn't work because they have defective VMPFCs. So let's kind of drill into this question a little bit more. So the insanity defense has been around since antiquity. It's sort of the way that the legal system deals with the fact that some people who commit crimes might not be in their right minds and so shouldn't be held as fully responsible. If a madman or a natural fool or a lunatic in the time of his lunacy or a child that has no knowledge of good or evil kill a man, this is no felonious act, they cannot be said to have any understanding will. That comes from the 1500s. Now in Oregon, the modern insanity statute is dictated by 161.295. Basically it says a person is guilty except for insanity if, as a result of mental disease or defect, at the time of engaging in criminal conduct, the person lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality of conduct or conform the conduct to the requirements of the law. So if we were to map this out visually, basically you have to say there's a qualifying mental disorder. That's the threshold condition. If that threshold condition is met, then there's a further analysis. Did that person lack substantial capacity at the time of the act to either appreciate right or wrong or control behaviors? Now let's run this analysis through a psychopath. So are psychopaths insane? So do they have a qualifying mental disorder? And another way to put this question is, are psychopaths mentally ill? And the answer to that question it kind of depends on who you ask. So courts use forensic experts. And so psychologists and psychiatrists would say, yeah, psychopaths have antisocial personality disorder. That's in the DSM-5. It's a personality disorder, but it is a mental illness. But of course, it's not the psychiatric expert that matters in court. It's the court who decides this question of whether something's a qualifying mental condition. And so the court's very clear on this. No. Psychopathy does not count as a qualifying mental disorder, and there's a specific provision in the statute that says the terms mental disease or defect, that's been replaced by qualifying mental disorder, do not include abnormality manifested by repeated criminal or antisocial conduct, nor do they include any abnormality constituting a solely personality disorder. So they specifically exclude psychopathy from this. But then you just have to say, well, I wonder if that's going to change, because isn't psychopathy a biological condition that's not their fault? I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that this may be considered a qualifying mental disorder at some point in the future. What about the next analysis, to lack substantial capacity to control behaviors? And that's a decision that's essentially made by the finders of fact in the case, the jury or the judge. And we have juries make this decision because the answer to this question depends on social norms, like how much impairment is substantial impairment. There's no mathematical formula that's going to give you that answer. It's a societal norm. It's society that has to answer that question. And this judgment also includes moral intuitions. Basically, it boils down to sympathy. Is impulsive behavior a disease, or is it just that you have a weak will, right? So the sympathy test, I think, is really essential in formulating the outcome to this prong. If the jurors feel highly sympathetic, they're more likely to say that they lack capacity to control behaviors. If you feel less sympathetic, you're more likely to say, no, that doesn't count, right? So when you think about other disorders like bipolar illness, what's your sympathy factor for someone with bipolar mania that doesn't seem to be able to control their behaviors? Highly sympathetic, right? What about addiction? That's like a little bit more tricky, right? Some people think that's weak will. Some, the medical model is becoming more prominent. That's somewhere in between. And I would argue that psychopathy falls pretty squarely with the frowny face, right? So psychopaths have an uphill battle convincing a jury that they lack a substantial capacity to control behaviors. The other prong, they lack substantial capacity to appreciate right and wrong. For me, it really depends on the word, on how you interpret the word appreciate. So there's knowing and there's appreciation. It's thought that knowing is cognitive and appreciation embodies a deeper level of understanding that includes knowledge but also includes emotions and feelings, right? So think about knowing, reading every book on how to play the violin versus picking up that damn thing and trying to play it, right? Think about knowing how big the Grand Canyon is versus going there and experiencing. Then you really appreciate how big it is, right? Think about parenthood. You can read every parenting book in the world. It tells you how tough parenting is, and it is tougher than all those books, right? I'm incredibly sleep deprived right now. All right, so, and you remember this quote? Psychopaths know the words, but not the music. I think it can be argued that psychopaths know what they're doing, but they don't appreciate what they're doing. You know, so I personally think they fulfilled this prong. But whether a jury believes that they fulfill this appreciation, you know, the studies have shown that the actual wording of nuances between knowing and appreciation, it doesn't matter. If juries don't feel sympathetic towards you, you basically, you know, are not found insane. If they are sympathetic for you, you're found insane. And one of the reasons we know this is in 1984 there was a huge revolution in the insanity world. After John Hinckley attempted to shoot Reagan and was found insane, there was a huge reform in insanity laws. Laws all over the country, including the federal statute, tightened up their language to make it a lot so knowing instead of appreciate, making it much harder to qualify for insanity. All those changes made no difference with juries. They didn't care whether you used knowing or appreciate, unable versus substantial lack of capacity. Those nuances were lost on jurors. But the main thing that did matter, anyone know what really changed how often insanity acquittals happened? Yeah. So they're more successful now? Oh, that's interesting. Well, yeah, I think they're less successful overall, though, because before 1984, the prosecution had to prove sanity beyond a reasonable doubt. After 1984, I'm talking about the federal statute, the burden shifted to the defense. The defense had to prove by preponderance that their client was insane. So it's the shifting of the burden of proof that really changed how difficult it was to get the insanity acquittals going. I bet there is, but I'm not rock solid on that research. So just to close this out, so right, are psychopaths insane? It depends who you ask, right? So a psychiatrist or a psychologist will say, well, there's a personality disorder, that's a mental disorder. The court says, no, I don't care about that. They don't qualify for a qualified mental disorder. So the analysis is done. If you don't meet the threshold condition, you're not insane. But just as a thought experiment, let's imagine that one day it is found to be a qualifying mental disorder. Then the decision is in the hands of the jury whether they lack substantial capacity to appreciate right or wrong or control behaviors. And I think this outcome really depends on the sympathy test. And I think at this point, probably not, right? You know, psychopaths are not a sympathetic population. You can also argue that they're not totally impaired. They're different than Phineas Gage, who had part of his brain removed, right? They just have underactive brains. And you know, because they're not sympathetic, they're not going to, you know, get all those little nuances about appreciation versus knowledge. Doesn't really matter. So the really important, interesting question, though, is that as biological roots become to be elucidated for more and more disorders, it tends to shift the sympathy, right? So the question is that going to happen with psychopaths as well? So just remember that, you know, initial sympathy, you know, gauge. I said, you know, how do you feel about Diane Downs? And I just gave you a bunch of neuroscience. I wonder if you could just check in with yourselves right now. Did that shift your sympathies towards, you know, psychopaths a little bit? Yeah. So learning the biological roots of behavior tends to shift against you know, stigma. So, and this has happened with epilepsy. Epilepsy used to be, you know, you're possessed by the devil. Now it's like, no, it's a storm in your brain. Major depression, it used to be like you're super lazy, and now we know it's like, okay, there's something really wrong with your brain, right? And addiction is getting there, right? So the more we learn about the biological roots of illness, it tends to shift the sympathy meter from less sympathetic to more sympathetic. And I predict this is going to happen to a certain extent with psychopaths. Now, to contrast that was Phineas Gage insane, right? Part of his brain was removed. And so let's run the analysis. I think any psychiatrist or judge would say, yeah, he had a large part of his brain removed. I think that's a qualifying mental disorder. And he's a very sympathetic character. Like, he was an upstanding citizen. He had this horrible traumatic accident happen to him. So I think that the jury is more likely to say, okay, well, he probably can control his behaviors, and they're going to hone in on the fact that although he might know what he's doing is wrong, he didn't appreciate it. So that's where the nuance comes in. If they're sympathetic, they're going to hang on to that nuance to get you freed, essentially. Does that make sense? Okay. What about mitigation? So who's this guy? Oh, come on, you guys were so good with all the other ones. This is Brian Dugan. Brian Dugan is a very bad man. Convicted of multiple murders, 1983, he raped and beat to death a 10-year-old girl. A year after that, he hit a nurse, and drowned her. In 1985, he raped and killed another little girl, 7-year-old girl. And one of the premier psychopath researchers, Kent Keel, testified in the sentencing phase. His testimony was allowed. As many of you know, in the sentencing phase, for especially a death penalty case, it's very wide the kind of evidence you can let into the court. And Kent Keel said Dugan is a psychopath, could not control his killer impulses. He scored very high in the psychopathy checklist, and he had decreased areas and parts of her brain that we've talked about. The result is that the jury still gave him the death penalty, but it took them a long time to decide that. So his defense lawyer said Keel's testimony turned it from a slam dunk case for the prosecution into a much tougher case. He ended up getting the death penalty, but a little twist is that Illinois abolished the death penalty while he was still on death row. So this guy is still alive. Now, anytime you invoke a biomechanism to explain behavior, especially dangerousness, it's a double-edged sword. Because if you said the brain is broken, and that's why this person was violent, that makes them both less culpable. Like, maybe it's not so much that their fault, so maybe they should get a shorter sentence. On the other hand, it makes them more dangerous because they can't control their behaviors to as much of an extent, right? So it could lead to a longer sentence, right? Ultimately, the judge has to decide, and I think the judge basically decides based on sympathy. If they're feeling sympathetic towards the biomechanism for psychopaths, they get a shorter sentence. If they're not, they get a longer sentence. Now, this has actually been tested in a science paper in 2012, where they presented judges in a mock case, a case of a psychopath, and sometimes they presented biomechanism data that they had atypical amygdala function. In the other half of cases, they didn't present that data, and it did affect sentencing. So when you mentioned brain abnormalities, the sentence went down from 13.9 years to 12.8 years. So it shaved almost a year off of the sentence in this mock trial. So basically, slightly less culpable. This is the last part of the talk. What to do? Right? This is, of course, how do you solve a problem like Maria? And this was inspired by my boss, Mickey Logan, who uses it as a teaching example in some of her. But she'd use toilet paper to make a little habit. Yes. So she's I'm so happy to have you as my boss. So for the first question is psychopathy, can it be treated, right? And so we talked about genes leading to brain abnormalities, leading to deviant behavior. So let's look at each one of these. So is there a genetic cure for psychopathy? Now, many of you know that gene therapy is coming along. In fact, 2 months ago, the FDA approved the very first gene therapy. So for those gene therapy is like you snip out the bad gene and you can snip in a good gene, right? We're getting better and better at that. The problem with psychopathy is that we don't know what the genes are yet. We know that it is a genetic condition from all the heritability studies, but we don't know what the genes are. But we do know from indirect evidence that there are many, many genes that are involved. So even after we find all the genes, to be able to simultaneously snip all the bad ones and put in all the good ones, it would require technical levels of technique that we don't have yet. That's a very long way away. But this is a cure. At the level of the gene, if you can fix that, you basically have fixed psychopaths. Long way off, though. What about the brain? What can we do at the level of the brain? We talked about the mouse and optogenetics. Optogenetics gives researchers a way to activate and deactivate with extreme precision parts of the brain, subsets of a brain. But it's mostly done in rats now. You have to use viruses. It's very complicated. So it's not quite ready for humans yet, although there are some experimental trials in humans. Deep brain stimulation is implanting an electrode deep in your brain, and that's being used a lot for Parkinson's disease, for instance. You can actually get rid of tremors that way. The DBS, deep brain stimulation, is really coming along. So now, not only do these modern electrodes stimulate, they can also sense. So they're doing things like in epilepsy, where the electrode can sense when a seizure is about to happen, and then inject energy into that area of the brain to abort the seizure. So these are called closed loop systems that allows you to basically make like pacemakers for the brain. So imagine if you can do that for violence. Imagine if you could put an electrode someplace that can detect when a violent storm is about to happen, and then inject electricity to abort that storm. That's not so infeasible. Now, invasive things where you inject, put electrodes deep in the brain, like most people are not like that into that, right? There's lots of ethical questions about doing that on criminals, right? So non-invasive technologies I find to be much more promising, and one of the most promising ones is TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Many of you know this as a treatment for depression. Right, so basically, it exists now. It's FDA approved for treating depression. It's non-invasive. It's safe. And basically, you put a magnetic coil on top of the head, and it generates magnetic pulses, which can dull and affect the brain. And it can take the area of brain underneath the coil, make it more active or less active. And actually, they've done lots of studies on empathy. And if you put the coil in the right part of the brain and you stimulate it, you can actually increase someone's empathy levels. Now, I look at these technologies and I think, that's super cool. Can I get that coil and can I put it in my brain? But a lot of you might be thinking more like, that doesn't sound so hot. The brain and the mind are like these sacred spaces, in our society where it's like, don't mess with my brain. That's why it's so hard for psychiatrists to give involuntary medications, because we really believe about the sanctity of your own mind, essentially. And so I think although there are technical challenges for this to advance to the point where we can give it to people to improve empathy, I think mostly it's societal barriers. It's what I call the yuck factor that really stymie this from going too far. So what about changing behaviors? Can we work on changing behaviors? So what about empathy training? Now, it turns out there are tons of, there are tons of ways to increase empathy. There's lots of mindfulness-based compassion programs. There are dozens of school-based social intelligence programs. And the meta-reviews are very positive. They all work. They all work. Empathy is both an inborn skill, and it's an inborn ability, and it's also a skill that improves with practice. It's like everything else, right? You're born with a certain level of math ability, but you can get a lot better if you study a lot of math, right? Same with every skill that you're born with. With practice, you can increase your ability. The problem with psychopaths is that practice requires motivation. And why on earth would psychopaths want to be more empathetic, right? So, this is what the world looks like to a psychopath. We're all suckers waiting to be conned, essentially. For them, the lack of empathy is an advantage, right? It's like they're not encumbered by morality, right? So then the question becomes, well, how do we create a world where the psychopaths can make pro-social choices, right? Oops. I don't want to leave you hanging. I want to give you the answer. See, the point is biology is not destiny. Psychopaths are born biologically different. So imagine you had a baby with psychopathic traits, and this is my baby Dean. I don't think he's a psychopath, but he is a copyright-free image, so I can use him. But let's imagine that this baby has low levels of empathy, low levels of fear, right? Doesn't learn well from punishment. That doesn't predetermine that you become a criminal, right? Maybe this baby can become a surgeon, right? Surgeons are famously low in empathy, and in fact, if you look at professions that are high in psychopathy, surgeons are number 5, right? This is from this book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths: What Saints, Spies, and Serial Killers Can Teach Us About Success. I love this image too. Anyway, so lawyers up there, CEOs up there. Clergy person was a bit of a surprise to me, but I don't know if anyone has any insight into that. But basically, you can have low levels of empathy, right? I mean, why do psychopaths do the horrible things, right? They want resources, they want gratification, they want to feel a sense of empowerment, right? Well, that's what surgeons get, right? They get to muck around in muck and gore. They get lots of money. They get respect. They get a sense of empowerment. We all want the same things. Psychopaths just have horrible ideas on how to do that, right? So the idea is, how do we nudge this baby to become a surgeon instead of a murderer? I think the key point to realize is that psychopaths are rational, and some people would even say hyper-rational because they're not encumbered by emotionality. Right? And they can play by the rule when it suits them. They know the rules better than you do. They are exquisite at playing the game and knowing the rules. And they can play by the rules when it suits them. So, I think a lot of their criminal behavior can be seen as selfish choices, hurting other people, but they're rational if you take into account that they don't have emotions about hurting other people, right? They're rational choices. So it's our job to come up with rational pro-social alternatives that can maybe drive them away from criminal behavior, right? How do we create a world where helping others is the way to get ahead? That's the essential question. If we create a world where helping others is the way to get ahead, then the selfish and the altruistic align. I think there are 3 conditions that have to be met. One is basic needs have to be met. Second is the rules have to be fair. Third is the culture has to be supportive. So Maslow is a famous psychologist who studied what people need to survive and thrive. He came up with this pyramid of hierarchy of needs. And he said lowest on the pyramid are physiological needs, need for food and water and stuff like that, next to safety needs. And it's only after you meet those needs that you can start to think about the needs of others, right? So if you're living below this line, you know, it's like you're living in a war zone where it's like a zero-sum game. If you have more, I have less, right? So, you know, what motivates me, I mean, what's good for me is not good for you and vice versa, right? But once we can you know, supply these basic needs, then if the rules are fair and the culture is supportive, then we can create a world in which you can do things that are good for you that are also good for other people. Put a pin on that. We'll be right. We'll circle around, but I want to go on a little detour. So the conventional wisdom is that psychopaths can't be treated, and here's some of the data that's based on. If you look at male psychopaths and what happens following conditional release, people who are high in psychopathy, so this is time after release, and this is recidivism rate. So people who are high in psychopathy, after 3 years, 80% of them have recidivated, right? If you look at people low in psychopathy, after 3 years, only 30% have recidivated. So they're very high recidivism rate psychopaths. And again, why is that? Because the VMPFC is essential for punishment learning and also vicarious learning. That's the basis from which we learn by pain, essentially. So if they don't have that area working well, they can't be deterred by punishment, essentially. I want to introduce you to Michael Caldwell, who runs the Mendota Mental Health Institute. This is an institute for juveniles that have had tremendous amounts of success treating young children with callous unemotional traits. So the Mendota Center is a collaboration between the DOC and the state hospital. So it's in Wisconsin, and basically there's the juvenile corrections run by the DOC, and then there's a Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center, which is administered by the DOC, but it's actually housed at the state hospital. There's special units that has only these psychopathic kids, and they're run by mental health professionals. So who goes here? Basically, the people who get sent from the juvenile corrections to the center are the people who failed prison. They're the worst of the worst. There are people who are like in solitary confinement all the time. And it's thought they're in this what's called a compression cycle, where they do an infraction, they're punished, like they're put into solitary confinement. That brings up levels of defiance because they don't respect what the authority figures, they don't respect what's happening to them. They're also lauded by their peers for standing up to the authority figures. So that creates a cycle where you commit more infractions, more solitary confinement, so you're in this compression cycle. So Caldwell calls what they do here decompression treatment. Their results are astounding. So if you look at recidivism rates of people, these are all psychopathic kids. Some of them, the black bars got the treatment. The gray bars didn't get the treatment. For any offense, the recidivism goes from 73% after 2 years to 52%, especially for violent crimes. So look at this, 44% recidivism without the treatment, 23%. So cut the recidivism rate in half. If you look at a 5-year map, and this is the number of days until the next violent offense, without the treatment, you very quickly recidivate. With the treatment, you're much, much slower to recidivate. And after 5 years, there's still 65% of these kids who haven't committed a violent crime. So the question is, what's their secret sauce, right? And you can say, oh, well, maybe these kids who didn't get the treatment, maybe they're easier to treat. Just you have to take my word for it. They're not easier to treat. Actually, like these kids they all come from the correctional center, and some of them are deemed to be amenable, like well enough to go back to prison. They only hang on to the really, really hard to treat people. So it's actually a reverse creaming process where the people that got this treatment, that got the improvement, were actually the worst offenders. So what is their secret sauce? First of all, the units are small. There are 4 units, and they're maximum of 15 beds. They're all male at this point. Very high staffing, so 1 psychologist and a social worker and a half-time psychiatrist for every 20 youth. That's about 3 times greater staffing levels than the prison. And they're treated for a long duration, for almost a year on average. And that's expensive. High staffing, small units, long duration, but it's less expensive than the alternative of people committing lots of crimes. There's lots of data on that. So here's the secret sauce. First of all, it's highly structured. There's clear and there's fair rules. There's a de-emphasis on punishment. Again, because why? Punishment doesn't work with these kids, right? So remember this? Remember this? Like the cookie jar and the fatal attraction, that doesn't deter them at all. And they're fearless, right? So they're not scared of getting more punishment, right? So, so they de-emphasize punishment, but they still use confinement, just like the state hospital. We never confine patients for moral reasons. It's only for safety, right? And it turns out that when they're in confinement, their amount of contact increases. This is not an isolation tank. They actually get increased levels of contacts when they're in confinement. They also emphasize rewards. They have a reward point program. So that takes advantage of the fact that they have really big donut detectors, right? They focus on positive social reinforcement, building pro-sociality. So they describe it this way: frequent, brief bouts of conversation at the door. They're building the building blocks for mutual cooperation. And the focus is on interpersonal processes. Hi, how you doing today? Not verbal processing. This is not therapy. In fact, there's been lots of studies that show that when you do traditional psychotherapy on psychopaths, they can actually get worse. One psychopath described it as finishing school for emotional manipulation, right? So this is not psychotherapy. This is just brief, hey, how you doing? Can I get you anything? Right? So I think what's happening here is that at the jails, right, in the prison, the youths hate the authority figures. They're the man. You have to fight the man. But in this place, the authority figures are someone that you can respect and may want a role model. They provide a desire to change for these youths. I think they see another way of being that might be actually better off for them, not just society, but for them, right? And the center provides alternative pathways. They give them skills that allow them to pursue goals that don't involve hurting people. Right? So this is a place where they've created a little microcosm where selfish interests and pro-social interests align. By helping others, that's how the world is structured. By helping others, by doing well, by behaving well, you get ahead. Right? This is a world where a psychopath can learn to behave pro-socially because it suits them. Okay. You guys have been super patient. This has been one of the most ambitious talks I've ever given, and we're down to the last 2 slides. I tried to make some review slides, and I was like, after a while, I was like, oh, it's just too much stuff. I can't review it all. But here's the take-home message. We started by talking about the world of repeat violent offenders, and we saw that there's 3 groups: severe mental illness and antisocial personality disorder. We unpacked this world to notice that there's 2 different populations, right? There's the world of this big category of antisocial personality disorder. That's 3% of adults, but they comprise 60% of people in prison. Versus psychopaths, which are 1% of adults and are 20% of prisoners, and they commit half of violent crimes. Now, the key message here is that these are mutually exclusive different populations. They're wired differently, they have different behaviors, and the treatments are different. So ASPD without psychopathy are hot-headed, lots of anxiety, very emotionally labile, lots of trauma. So, to treat this population, you need some sort of, trauma-centered approach, essentially, right? And they can learn from punishment. I'm not a big fan of prisons, but punitive, outcomes, they can learn from that, right? That's very different from this population that's cold-blooded, right? Low anxiety, fear, mostly detached. So here, it's a genetic condition. And so you need specialized treatment, like treatment that they have at the Caldwell Center. So I don't work at the OIA. I don't know if any of you do. If the OIA isn't doing this, they should do this. They should take the people that they get, first figure out whether they're this population or a psychopathic population. If they're a psychopath, they should be housed in a special unit and get special treatment with specialized staff. That's the way to change the course of these youths' behaviors. Now, it's not just about fixing psychopaths, right? So a lot of the treatment, what I talked about is how do we fix the psychopath? What do we do? Change their genes, change their brain, change their behaviors. We also have to fix the world around them. This gets to the gene by environment question that was raised earlier. Psychopaths, so we described a world where if your basic needs aren't met, it's a war zone, right? And your needs and my needs and your needs are very different, right? It's only when after basic needs are met and we make the rules fair and the culture supportive that these needs, the needs of the self and the needs of the other can align. So we all need to think about how do we create a world where this happens, right? Right? Do we all want to live inside an episode of The Celebrity Apprentice? Is that like the world we want to live in? If not, let's make the world less like the Celebrity Apprentice. Let's make it fair. Let's make it, where altruism is really supported and encouraged and rewarded. And the bottom line for me is like, I think this basic needs thing is the most important part of the equation. I mean, as a psychiatrist at the state hospital, I've seen numbers of cases where an untold amount of suffering, occurred just because someone didn't have safe, stable housing. Let's get everyone safe, stable housing. Let's just get rid of the war zone mentality, And again, this is an altruistic act, but it's also a selfish act. I don't want to be attacked on my way home. I mean, someone was literally killed in a park, 10 blocks away from my home a couple of weeks ago. So by making the world a good place, we're helping the world and we're helping ourselves. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I mean, I'm willing to stay as long as we need to.
I had one quick question that was actually about one of your earlier slides. Sorry. Is it on? Okay. Yeah, I had one quick question about one of your earlier slides, and it was the criteria for mass shootings. How many, it's kind of morbid, but how many people are required to have been killed or injured in one of those shootings in order for it to be considered mass? Yeah,
so the definitions vary. The FBI definition is 4 or more people shot at in a single incident. So killing is not required, it's just shot at. So that's the FBI definition. That's the definition that most of these statistics that I've shown you come from. 4 or more, yeah. Other questions? Or?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
So we talked about the rational criminality, like cold-blooded, hot-blooded. But what about for the irrational? Is the point to give them more tools to formulate a rational mind instead of...
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, with the severely mentally ill that commit violent crimes, I mean, for a lot of those folks, if we could alleviate their psychiatric condition, they would no longer be violent, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's about treatment. It's about treating these folks. It's about treating their mental illness, essentially.
Yeah, I feel like that's very important.
Absolutely. So I focus mostly on the psychopaths, not the severely mentally ill.
Okay.
But yeah.